History and Biography is sponsored by Wells Fargo.
Good day. I'm Andrea Mitchell from NBC News and MSNBC, and welcome. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 20th anniversary of the National Book Festival presented by the Library of Congress. And we are thrilled to have today our author, David Rubenstein, who has authored a new book, and his new book is How to Lead. And it is an extraordinary combination of conversations on leadership, on the qualities that make people the leaders, especially these very special people, these unique individuals that David has assembled in his book. David Rubenstein, welcome. You're a lawyer. You're a former White House domestic policy advisor. You were a founder of the world's largest private equity firm. You're a history buff. You're a philanthropist. You restored the Washington Monument. You've saved the pandas, the great pandas at the National Zoo. You brought the Magna Carta to the archives, to say nothing of having a very popular television interview show on Bloomberg and on PBS. How do you do it all? Tell us about your leadership.
Well, I didn't feel I was as good a leader as the people I interviewed. So in the book, I talk a little bit about what I tried to do as a leader, but recognizing I wasn't really at the level of the people I interviewed, I really went out and tried to interview the most famous people I could that I knew who were leaders, people in business or culture or the arts or sports. And that the book is basically a summary of what they told me and what it takes to be a leader.
If you were to distill any particular qualities of leadership from these people, and we'll get more specific in a moment because these are extraordinary stories, tell me what you found to be the most important qualities or the connective thread among them.
Persistence is number one, because nobody wakes up and can get anything done they want. Nobody has ideas that are so brilliant that people say, yes, that's great. When Jeff Bezos said, I'm going to sell books over the internet, people laughed. So you have to be persistent. You also have to know how to communicate with other people, learn how to get people to work for you or with you. So the skill of influencing people is very important. And also, I think it's also important to be humble. Humility gets you further than, I think, arrogance. Obviously, some people are arrogant, get far. But in the end, I think the most admired leaders are ones that are humble. They're highly ethical. They're people that also want to do something useful with their life. And they think that what they're doing is useful. And in many cases, it is.
Now, you've chaired the board at Duke. You're a fellow on the Harvard Corporation. You're on the board of Johns Hopkins Medicine. All of these academic institutions, the University of Chicago. Yet one aspect that you found among some of these leaders is they dropped out of school. They didn't graduate college. I'm speaking, of course, of Bill Gates, Richard Branson. Let me ask you about Gates. He tells you that if he had not dropped out of Harvard, he doesn't think that Microsoft would have dominated the software market when he was first creating all of that.
Well, the very famous dropout, of course, is Bill Gates. And Bill Gates dropped out because he thought he was going to miss the software revolution. As he later says, and a bit in the interview, he alludes to it, he says he was actually wrong. The software revolution waited a couple more years. So he actually, had he graduated, it wouldn't have made that much of a difference. But at the time, he didn't know that. And imagine, telling your father and your mother, who are very well educated, I'm dropping out of college to start a company in the software world when nobody really knew what software was. The same is true. I didn't interview him for this book, but Mark Zuckerberg basically did the same thing. So sometimes college dropouts, Richard Branson's is a high school dropout, actually. He had dyslexia, wasn't good in school. So it's important to get education. I'm glad my children have completed their degrees, but very often people can be successful without a college degree.
In the case of Richard Branson, he told you, and he is so hugely successful, that his secret is surrounding himself with great people. But you point out in your narrative that he listens to the great people he surrounds himself with.
Yes, there are some great leaders that like to surround themselves with famous people, but they don't listen to them. And one of the great things about being a leader is you listen to other people. And in fact, in the book, I interview Oprah Winfrey, and I say, well, why are you such a good interviewer? And she says, because I listen to what people actually say. And that's what makes a good interviewer.
How much of being a great leader is being a calculated risk taker? Because Branson tells you, for instance, he started his airline when he got bumped from a commercial flight, from Puerto Rico to the Virgin Islands and decided to charter a plane and then fill it up with all of these other bumped passengers, and ended up going into the business and starting with one 747, a used 747, going up against 300 planes that British Airways had. And back in the day, they had Pan Am and TWA. So he was starting from scratch, at least with the airline business.
I think it's true of most leaders. They didn't have a McKinsey report or a Bain Company report saying, here's how you can become a leader. It happened by serendipity. So many times people just had a lucky break, and all of a sudden something happened to them. For example, Jim Bakker is asked to run a campaign for George Herbert Walker Bush. And Jim Bakker says, I'm a Democrat and you're running as a Republican. And I don't know anything about politics, but obviously it worked out for Jim Bakker and George Herbert Walker Bush. And it wasn't something that was planned. Very often the greatest things in life are not planned.
Well, you said that Oprah is a listener also, and that she tells you that she tries to understand the impact of what is being said by people. What do you think is the quality that makes her connect so directly to people, whether it's a live audience or in a film or in a play?
It's a word that has come about recently in the news. It's called empathy. You have to empathize with people. And when people can sense that you empathize with them, you connect with them. And she's the best at that. And as I like to say in the book, she does it so well that she doesn't need a second name. So she's like Cher or Madonna or Bono. Basically, the first name does it all. And as I like to say in the book, I did in my interview of her, I said, well, why don't you consider running for president? You know, you don't have to be a government official anymore. And maybe she flirted with it for a while, but then in the end, she realized being Oprah is better than being president.
For sure, I think. The other thing about Oprah's trajectory also is getting demoted, getting fired, losing a job, and then discovering something else that you're even better at.
Yes. I think most leaders have failed. If you haven't failed in life, you're not probably going to be very successful in something you ultimately do. You have to fail. Something has to really make you go down. Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, they all failed at something or another, and that makes you a stronger leader. And Oprah was fired from one job and basically was about to be fired from another when she ultimately went to Chicago and became famous.
Among men and women whom you've interviewed in this book, Christine Lagarde. Yeah. Here she was the managing director of the largest law firm in the country, born in France, educated partly in the US, but then she ends up in Chicago running this big law firm. And then she becomes the finance minister of France. Then she becomes, through a lot of other events, the emergency, really, head of the IMF after her predecessor was deposed. And now she is at the European Central Bank. So she steers the IMF through Greece, Argentina debt crises. Now she's in Europe in a pandemic and about to face the Brexit fallout or whatever else. What gives her the qualities to lead the world practically now through this?
Well, Christine would say that she was always underestimated, in part because she was a woman. She was the first woman to head that law firm, the first woman to be a finance minister in Europe, the first woman to head IMF, and the first woman to head the central bank in Europe. Being underestimated, she said, help. Now, I kind of kiddingly said, tongue-in-cheek, that her real success was that when she was a youngster, she was a synchronized swimmer on the French national team. And maybe there's something to synchronized swimming that we could all learn something from, because she really knows how to get along with people and get them to kind of follow her. And the trick to being a leader is you have to get people to follow you. You can't be a leader if nobody follows you. And so she's very good at getting people to follow her. And you get people to follow you by being a very good communicator. You have to say to somebody in writing or orally, this is what we should do, and inspire them. But the best way to be a leader, without doubt, is to do it through not words or through writing, but it is by showing by example. So as an example I often like to give is when George Washington was at Valley Forge, he didn't have to stay there with his troops in 1777, freezing as they were. He could have gone down to the Ritz-Carlton or the Four Seasons downtown Philadelphia and stayed there while his troops were freezing, but he didn't. He stayed with his troops, and that's what really made them really loyal to him.
Yeah, and that the Ritz-Carlton would have been a much better bet, or the Four Seasons in Philadelphia.
No doubt.
Valley Forge, no doubt. When you talk to Lagarde and you talk to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it becomes so apparent that among the women, they have to achieve before they have to prove themselves first. They are not picked out by the men who make these choices as they're climbing up through the ranks.
You know, the amazing thing that we think about is we're celebrating this year the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote. And when you go back and read about it, many women, including Eleanor Roosevelt, were against the women's right to vote. So it was a different world then. Women couldn't vote. They couldn't go to office, become office seekers or hold office. They just didn't have any of these things. And for example, President Kennedy, who I admire greatly, he had no women in his cabinet. Now, if you're a president of the United States, you need to have women in your cabinet to be a good president and to hear from people that have a different perspective. But it's a different world than it was. And all the women that I've written about or that I interviewed all struggled. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a classic example. First in her class at Harvard Law School, first in her class at Columbia Law School, she couldn't get a job.
And that was also true, of course, of Sandra Day O'Connor, who had preceded her on the court. She could not get a job, so she took a job in a desk outside of the law firm there in California, even though she had placed so well. I think came in either first or second at Stanford. When you talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the relationship between those two women was so special, so mentoring, as I observed myself. Here she is, the oldest justice on the court, the only one who's a rock star. She wins over her colleagues, partly with charm and civility. The storied relationship between her and Justice Scalia. You asked whether or not it was awkward when they would go to the opera, and her answer was that no, it wasn't awkward because she loved him for his sense of humor. They had developed that relationship on the Third Circuit before they were in the Supreme Court together. And he used to whisper jokes to her when they were on the bench, and she could practically, have to hold herself back from laughing out loud. Tell us about that connection.
Well, they both are opera fans, and they love to go to the Kennedy Center and opera. And a couple of times when I've introduced her as the chairman of the Kennedy Center, I've introduced her as being in the audience. She gets a standing ovation. But she got along with Justice Scalia because while he might have disagreed with her, he was not disagreeable. And so they got a great relationship. And in her case, I asked her at the beginning, how does it feel to wake up every morning and know that 330 million Americans want to know the state of your health? And obviously, many of them want her health to be spectacular, and I hope it will be for quite some time.
The true grit that she has shown, and in dealing with this, with the illnesses and all that she had to go through and still is going through, how much is toughness as well as intellect? Because her intellect is incredible. It's overwhelming.
Well, I think about the kind of situation she faced. She was one of the few women in her class in law school. She was at the top of her class, and she still couldn't get some of the honors that people normally would get if they were men. And she also now has had her fourth bout with cancer. She's 87 years old. She must weigh less than 100 pounds, but she has the grit and determination, as you say, that's made her a rock star. And I doubt of the 114 people who've ever served on the Supreme Court, anybody has been as popular in the public as she has been.
Talk to me about Tim Cook. Here he comes in succeeding a creative force like Steve Jobs and knowing he can't replicate him. And instead of trying, he takes it in a completely different direction.
Yes, some people who are basketball fans will remember that there was a great basketball coach, John Wooden at UCLA, who won, I think, 10 championships. Who wanted to succeed him? Well, the person who did lasted a very short period of time. Succeeding a legend isn't easy. And so Tim Cook, people thought he might last a very short period of time as well. But he's been there for quite a while now, and he has actually tripled the value of the company. Why? Because he said, I'm not going to be Steve Jobs. I'm not Steve Jobs. I'll do the opposite. I'll get along with people, collaborate, work on the operation. So Steve Jobs was great for what he did, but Tim Cook has really made the company even more successful. And he recognizes that he's not Steve Jobs. That's very important.
Is there a difference between the leaders that you found, like Gates and Tim Cook, who are successful in the tech world, and the other kinds of creative forces, such as the musicians and artists or politicians? Is there some quality that distinguishes them, or is there a more universal quality?
Well, generally, tech CEOs tend to be more focused inward on the technology, and they don't tend to spend as much time in the outside world. So for a long time, until recently, the tech CEOs didn't really want to come to Washington and deal with a lot of the Washington kind of issues. Now they're being forced to come to Washington. But generally, the tech people are more drawn in, I would say. Whereas people that in politics or people in the cultural world, the arts, they have to go out and express themselves all the time to a larger audience. So take Yo-Yo Ma, who I introduced. He's the world's most famous and the best cellist, but his greatest strength is his personality, in my view, because he really shows people how passionate he is about art.
As a failed string player, I know how important the technical skills of Yo-Yo Ma are, but I agree completely, and you know better than I, his passion is part of his artistry, his enthusiasm, And one of the things you notice, he shows it with whoever he's with, whether it's a group of school children. I've known he's gone to Native Americans on reservations to try to bring arts to them as part of the presidential program, or whether he's at the Kennedy Center or on any other world stage. So that's part of his.
He's a great cultural ambassador.
Now, in talking about Yo-Yo Ma also, the public personality of these artists and Renee Fleming, that's the performance part. Do you see that also in politicians, which is going to bring me to Nancy Pelosi as the next question?
As somebody that has been around politicians much of your career, you know that they will say things off the record and that they won't say them on the record. But really, the great politicians, they are the same inside or outside or on the record, off the record. So Nancy Pelosi is a good example. She and I are both from Baltimore. We've had a special connection because of that. And what she's done is amazing. You think about it, in the 250-year history of our country, no woman has even come close to the power she's had, and for such a long period of time. And now she's 80 years old. She just celebrated her 80th birthday, and she's in the prime of her power. And so it's quite amazing what she's done, from being a housewife in San Francisco to being Speaker of the House for a long period of time. It's quite amazing what she's done.
And even becoming the first speaker in 2006. And the way she showed the female side of her was to bring all the children up to the podium. I was on the Hill that day covering it live, and she brought all the children and grandchildren off of the floor. She has 9 now herself, but it was something that certainly no male speaker would have thought of doing. Also, coming back from defeat, because they lost the election in 2010,
right,
and she was pilloried for it, and then thereafter, and fought back in 2018. So how much is resilience part of leadership?
Resilience is very important, because you're going to be beaten up no matter what you do in life, and you have to stand up and be resilient. If you get something happens bad to you, I think, and you don't come back, you're not going to be a very effective leader. I've met some people in my career who didn't have real setbacks, and when they got a little bit older, they weren't used to setbacks, and so when they had setbacks later in their career, they really couldn't come back. They weren't resilient, and I think getting some defeats early on is important. I say in the book that I think I divide life into 3 parts, and many people who succeed in the second and third part failed in the first part, but they were resilient and they fought and they kept coming back. And you have to be resilient if you're going to be an effective leader, in my view.
Are you able to judge among all of these people whether being born with wealth or privilege is an asset or a hindrance in developing resilience and grit?
Well, I like to say that the hardest thing in the world to do successfully is raise children who are happy and healthy. And it's very hard if you are a child from a wealthy family. As we've all seen, many children from wealthy families are spoiled and they don't really have the motivation. So I try to think that if you're born in a wealthy family, yes, you have certain privileges, but in the end, if you accomplish something, you have to overcome the perception you got there because of the wealth. So I don't really think that the most successful people in the world ever come from extremely wealthy families. And in fact, it's very rare that a Nobel Prize winner is coming from somebody who was in the Forbes 400 list. Nobel Prize winners are coming from lower, middle income families or blue collar families. Those are the people that have the drive to push forward. If you come from a wealthy family, you really have to struggle to have drive.
In the current context, and all of us are struggling with the pandemic, and our leaders are, and CEOs are, what advice do you have for business leaders as they decide what risks to take, how safe it is to reopen, what conditions, how to deal with loss, how to take care of the health, what responsibilities they have to their employees?
I think business leaders, and I've interviewed a number of them recently about how they're dealing with COVID, their highest responsibility is to their employees, and they want to make sure that they're healthy and they can perform their jobs in a healthy and safe manner. Then their customers. But you have to make sure that people that work for you feel that you care about them, you're empathetic to them, and you just don't worry about profits. And I think the way that the world will evolve after COVID is behind us is that people will change the way they live. We will not be traveling probably as much for quite some time. We will probably be doing more things remotely, more things from home, more things on these kind of devices. And I think the world really will change. But also people are more worried about their health than ever. Because what COVID brought to me was this. I'm now 70 years old. I used to view myself as an aging baby boomer, but a baby boomer. I'm still active. Now I'm looked at as a senior citizen. because when I go to the Whole Foods market, they say, well, here's the senior citizen line, Mr. Rubenstein. You can go over here. You can come in a little bit earlier or something. So I realize that you're looked at differently, but also the most important thing is the fragility of life. What we learned through COVID is how quickly life can go away. Baby boomers like you and I, were baby boomers, we thought, okay, if we make it to 70, we'll get to 80, we'll get to, your husband is 94?
94.
94. So I saw him the night of dinner, and he was great at the dinner the other night. He knows exactly, what's going on, and he was terrific. So many people think if you get to 70 in this day and age, you're going to make it to 94. But with this COVID, you realize your life could be wiped out in 1 or 2 weeks without a chance to say goodbye. So it made to me think how fragile life is and how lucky I got here and how important it is to me to be safe and healthy in doing this, not to take risks. And that's what I really think people should learn through COVID. Don't take risks. Life is very fragile.
You're so involved in so many great medical institutions at Hopkins, Harvard, and else who are on the forefront of all of this. How optimistic are you that we can get through this?
Well, in terms of a vaccine, the fastest vaccine ever developed was for mumps, took 4 years. The Sabin vaccine and the Salk vaccine took 7 years. Average is about 10 years. So we're trying to telescope that into about a year. Now, because we have so much money being put at it and so many companies are working on it, about 130, I do think we'll get a vaccine. Whether the vaccine will be as effective as we would like it to be, I don't know. But I do think by the first half of next year, there will be several vaccines. Now, the trick is not just getting the vaccine, it's developing it so that it can be distributed to people at affordable costs. That's the real challenge.
Do you worry about American leadership in the world as we have businesses that are obviously in a global economy, but now are competing under a very different political system, it seems, a political climate?
I do worry about it. I interviewed in another situation this morning the Prime Minister of Singapore. And he was basically making the plea for America to not recede back into its borders, but to be an Asian power and remain an Asian power, because the world's better off if the United States plays the role that we played in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, to some extent, leaving some of the wars aside. But we've done so many great things. And I do worry whether we are as effective a leader around the world as we used to be.
You mentioned Jim Baker, because that interview was a wonderful interview, and it read in the book even better than when I first saw it. One of his bywords was preparation. I've never known anyone, when he was White House Chief of Staff or Treasury or Secretary of State, who did his homework more. And that's how I got to know him better, even after the earlier campaigns, when I was covering the White House. And I would be the only one on Saturday or Saturday night, as a young correspondent. He'd be picking up his own phone because he was preparing for the Sunday morning talk shows.
He is always prepared. And after he left as in the government, he served in my firm as an advisor for about 12 years. So I got to see him up front. And as I said in the book, very often when you get to meet famous people and spend time with them, you see their flaws and they're not as good as their press. But it's the opposite with him. I admire him more than I did before I got to know him. And the statement that he got from his father was, which I tell my children all the time and everybody: prior preparation prevents poor performance. And it's true. He's always prepared.
Yeah, he was one of those people who inherited a legacy as James A. Baker III, and it didn't hurt him at all. He still has the grit and the resilience. Talk to me about Warren Buffett. A huge influence on Bill Gates, of course, a great mentor of him, and such a surprising, almost elf-like figure for being the great, guru that he is.
It's an interesting thing. In the history of the world, nobody's made as much money as an investor for himself or for other people as Warren Buffett. And he started with essentially nothing, and now he's one of the richest people in the world, though he's now giving away bulk of his money to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But when you sit down with Warren Buffett, you don't see a person bragging about how rich he is. You don't see a person bragging about how smart he is. You just hear jokes or humility and self-deprecating humor. And it's really makes you feel it's great when you can meet people that have accomplished so much, but they are humble. And that's one of the things I really like leaders to show is humility, self-deprecating humor, not taking themselves too seriously.
Okay, whom have you not interviewed that you would love to?
Well, the interviews you can't do. The Queen Elizabeth doesn't do interviews. The Pope doesn't do interviews. But I think I've never actually interviewed Andrea Mitchell. So maybe I could, sometime I could interview Andrea.
Turning tables. That would be such a great pleasure, but I'm not sure I could answer all of those whimsical David Rubenstein questions that come out of the blue, seemingly. What is one of the most unguarded questions that you ever asked anyone? Can you think?
Well, I always like to ask people what makes them a leader. And sometimes I do throw in whimsical questions. So, for example, one time I interviewed the CEO of an automobile company. I think it was Mary Barra. Yeah. Mary, when I go buy a car and the salesman goes to back to talk to his sales manager, what is he really doing back there? Are they really negotiating the price, or are they just having a cup of coffee and then coming out and say, I can get this price or that price? I always wondered, and she said she had a lot of dealers in the audience and she didn't want to quite say, she didn't know. But I think some kind of offbeat questions sometimes loosen the tension a little bit.
I think did you ask her whether she fills up her own gas?
Yes, I did. I asked her, you're the CEO of General Motors. Are you out there filling up your own gas? She said, yes, she is. And I've asked the CEO of Exxon. I did interview Rex Tillerson once. It's not in the book. And he asked him if when he was driving, does he always go to Exxon? If he can't find an Exxon station, will he go to another gasoline station? I also asked him if there's any difference between the gasoline in Exxon, Sunoco, or others. And he didn't give a straight answer on that one, I think.
Because you know that there isn't. Well, David Rubenstein, it is such a pleasure. How to Lead is a great book. You've captured these people, as you always do, on television and in your book. And I just know everyone's going to read it and love it as I did. But thank you so much for letting me.
And I hope we can get my interview of you at some point, okay?
That would be great.
All right. Thank you very much, Andrea.
At the National Book Festival.